The wagon hit the frozen rut so hard that Vivian Carter nearly lost her grip on the cedar cradle she'd been clutching since Cheyenne. She didn't drop it. She never dropped it. But the man sitting across from her in the wagon bed, a thick-necked rancher with a silver watch chain and the kind of smile that never reached his eyes, had noticed. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, studying the cradle the way a buyer studies livestock he intends to acquire cheaply. "That thing worth something to you?" he asked. Vivian looked at him. "Yes." "Pity," he said, settling back. "Women who carry ghosts into new country usually don't last the first winter." He said it pleasantly, the way a man says something true that he wants to sound like advice. "Especially ones coming out to the Briggs place. That man can barely keep a horse fed." He laughed once, short and dry, and looked away, done with her entirely. Vivian held the cradle tighter and said nothing. She'd learned a long time ago that men like him didn't need encouragement. They needed an audience, and she wasn't going to be one. But she filed the name away. Briggs Place. The man she was traveling to marry. And whoever this rancher was, he already had opinions about what was going to happen out there. That was the first thing that worried her. It wasn't the last. If you've ever had to start completely over with nothing but what you could carry, then you already understand something about Vivian Carter that most people in Harlan Creek, Wyoming, never bothered to learn. Before you follow her any further into this story, I want to ask you to do something. If this is the kind of story that keeps you watching, the kind that makes you forget you were supposed to start dinner, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the bell so you don't miss what comes next. Drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning of how everything changed. Vivian had not planned to answer a mail-order advertisement. She had not planned a lot of things. She hadn't planned to spend 3 years nursing her younger sister through a sickness that had no name and no cure. She hadn't planned to watch Margaret die in March, in a rented room in Omaha that smelled of coal smoke and old wood, with a cradle in the corner that had been built for a baby who never came. She hadn't planned to be 28 years old with no family left, no savings worth counting, and a landlord who wanted the room back by the end of the week. But plans had a way of not surviving contact with the actual shape of a person's life. She'd found the advertisement in a folded newspaper left on the bench of a laundry where she'd gone to ask about work. Widower, rancher, one daughter age 6. Seeks capable woman of sound character. Not romance. Partnership. There was an address in Wyoming territory. No name. Just the address and 4 words at the bottom that had stopped her cold. Honest terms. Honest life. She'd read it 3 times. She didn't answer it because she was romantic. She answered it because honest was a word she hadn't seen applied to anything in a very long time. The correspondence had been brief and direct on both sides, which she'd appreciated. His name was Colton Briggs. He'd lost his wife to fever 2 winters ago. He had 80 acres, a working cattle operation, his word, working, though she'd noticed he didn't say thriving, and a daughter named Pearl who hadn't spoken much since her mother died. He needed someone who could manage a household, contribute to the ranch work, and be patient with a child who was still grieving. He was not offering love, he was not promising comfort. I was offering a home and a fair arrangement between 2 adults who needed something the other could provide. She'd written back, "I am not coming for romance either. I am coming because I need somewhere to be useful. I will work. I will be patient. I expect honesty in return." He'd replied with train fare and directions. That was the whole courtship. She'd met the man with the silver watch chain on the train platform in Cheyenne, where she'd had to wait 6 hours for a connecting wagon north. He'd introduced himself as Douglas Hale. He said it the way men say names they expect you to recognize, with a slight pause after, waiting for the reaction. She hadn't given him one, which seemed to bother him. He was maybe 50, well-fed, dressed in the particular way of men who wanted you to know they had money without appearing to try. He'd been heading north too, he said. Had business in the area. Asked where she was bound. She'd told him, Harlan Creek, and watched something move behind his eyes that she couldn't quite read. "Harlan Creek," he'd repeated. "Small place. You got family out there?" "I'm going to work," she'd said. It was true enough. He'd nodded slowly, the way men nod when they've already decided something. A lot of women come through this country looking for a fresh start. Most of them end up going back east inside a year. The winters here aren't kind to people who didn't grow up with them. I'll manage, she'd said. He'd smiled. I'm sure you think so. It was that smile, patient, certain, slightly contemptuous, that she kept returning to during the wagon ride north. The driver was a young man named Pete, who didn't say much and smelled of pine pitch, and she'd been grateful for his silence. Hale had ridden up front with him at first, but somewhere in the second hour he'd climbed back to sit in the wagon bed, and that was when he'd seen the cradle. He'd made his comment about women who carry ghosts. She'd said nothing. He'd gotten out at a property about 4 miles before Harlan Creek, a spread that even from the road looked substantial, with new fence posts and a barn that could hold 40 head easy. He hadn't said goodbye. He'd just stepped down, dusted his coat, and walked toward the house without looking back. Pete had watched him go, and then, very quietly, said, "You want my advice, ma'am? You'll stay away from Douglas Hale." She'd looked at the boy. Why? He'd kept his eyes on the road. Because everything he looks at long enough ends up belonging to him, eventually. Harlan Creek was smaller than she'd expected and colder than she'd prepared for, though she'd packed wool and wasn't sentimental about discomfort. The town was a main street, a feed store, a dry goods, a post office that doubled as a telegraph office, and a saloon that looked like it had been built first, and everything else arranged around it as an afterthought. She'd climbed down from the wagon outside the dry goods, the cedar cradle in her arms, her single trunk waiting to be fetched, and she'd been aware immediately that people were watching her. Not rudely, most of them tried to look like they weren't, but watching nonetheless. She understood why. Word traveled fast in small places. Colton Briggs's mail-order bride had arrived. Everyone already had an opinion. She could see it in the way the woman sweeping the dry goods steps looked at her. Sympathetic, a little sad, the way you look at someone who doesn't know yet what they're walking into. She squared her shoulders and looked for Colton Briggs. He was standing beside a wagon across the street. She almost missed him because she'd half expected, without meaning to, something easier to read. A man who advertised himself honestly. Something open in his face, maybe. Instead, he was lean, weathered, a few years older than his letter had suggested, with dark circles under his eyes and a jaw set like he was bracing for something. His hat was good quality but old. His boots were clean. He was holding a small girl against his left side. The child had her face pressed into his coat, and he was watching Vivian the way a man watches a doctor arrive, hoping, but not sure he can afford to hope. She crossed the street. He straightened. The girl, Pearl, turned her face just enough to look with one eye, then buried it again. "Mr. Briggs," Vivian said. "Miss Carter." He looked at the cradle. He didn't say anything about it. That, more than anything, made her think she might be able to work with him. "Train was on time," he said, which was not really a sentence, but she understood it was an attempt. "It was," she said. "I appreciate you sending the fare." He nodded. An awkward silence developed between them. He seemed to be waiting for her to say something, and she seemed to be waiting for him to. And in the end, he said, "Pearl, this is Miss Carter. She's going to be staying with us." Pearl made no response that Vivian could detect. "That's all right," Vivian said quietly. She wasn't talking to Colton. She was talking to the top of Pearl's head. "You don't have to say anything today." Something shifted in Colton's face. Very small. Almost invisible. He picked up her trunk without asking and put it in the wagon, and she climbed up and they drove north out of town in silence, which suited her fine. The ranch was not what she'd call beautiful, but it was honest, which matched the letter. The house was weathered gray board and needed paint. The barn was better kept than the house, which told her something about the man's priorities. There was a kitchen garden that had been given up on sometime in the fall and not cleared properly. A woodpile that was lower than it should be for January. She cataloged these things the way she always cataloged things, not as judgments, but as facts she could work with. Inside, the house was clean enough but hollow in the way that places get when there hasn't been anyone paying attention to the details. The dishes were washed but stacked wrong. The kitchen window had a draft that someone had stuffed with a rag and then ignored. There was a quilt on the settee that had been mended badly, the stitches too big, by someone who clearly hadn't been taught properly. She suspected that had been Colton's attempt. He stood in the middle of the kitchen watching her look at things, and she could feel his discomfort and made an effort not to add to it. "It's a good house," she said, "with some work." He let out a breath. "I know it's not," he started, then stopped. I've been managing most things alone. I can see that, she said, and she meant it without cruelty. You've kept it together. That's not nothing. Pearl had drifted to the corner of the room near the stove and was watching Vivian from behind the edge of the wall. The child was small for 6, with her father's dark eyes and hair that hadn't been properly braided in probably weeks. Vivian set the cedar cradle on the table, carefully, and began to unbutton her coat. Where would you like me to put this? She asked Colton, touching the cradle. He looked at it. What is it? It belonged to my sister, she said. She's gone. I carried it because I couldn't leave it. He was quiet for a moment. There's a shelf in the back room, sturdy one. Thank you. Pearl was staring at the cradle now. Not at Vivian, at the cradle. What's it for? The girl said. It was the first thing Pearl had said. Colton went very still. Vivian looked at the child directly. It was for a baby that didn't come, she said. But it's a beautiful piece of work, so I kept it. Pearl thought about this. Our baby didn't come either, she said. Mama was going to have one, but then she got sick. The silence that followed was the particular kind that has weight. I'm sorry, Vivian said. Pearl looked at her for a long moment. Then she pushed off the wall and walked to the cradle and touched the side of it with 2 fingers, very carefully, like she was touching something that might not be real. Colton looked like he'd stopped breathing. Well, the first week was not a romance. It was a negotiation between practical people who didn't entirely trust each other yet, and Vivian thought that was exactly right. She asked questions before she changed anything, where things were kept, what routines Pearl had developed, what Colton needed most in the mornings before he went out. She didn't rearrange his kitchen the first day. She fixed the window draft because that was just cold air and efficiency, but she asked before she moved anything personal. He seemed surprised every time she asked. She figured his expectations had been either that she'd be useless and decorative or that she'd steam in and take over without consideration. She was neither, and it seemed to unsettle him briefly before he settled into it. On the 4th morning, he came in from the barn at 7 to find breakfast on the table. Eggs, biscuits, the last of a smoked ham she'd found at the bottom of the cold cellar, and Pearl sitting in her usual chair, eating without being coaxed, which apparently was not always the case. He stood in the doorway in his coat and just looked at the table. Sit down before it gets cold, Vivian said, not looking up from the pan she was cleaning. He sat down. He ate. Halfway through, he said, Pearl didn't eat breakfast for about 2 months after her mother died. Vivian kept cleaning the pan. I know, she told me. He looked up. She told you. We talked this morning. She woke up early. Vivian set the pan on its hook. She's not a complicated child, Mr. Briggs. She just wants someone to answer her questions. What questions? She asked me if I was going to leave like her mother did. Vivian turned to face him. I told her I didn't plan to. Colton's expression did something complicated. He looked down at his plate. What did she say to that? She said okay, and asked me if I knew how to make cornbread. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was near enough. She's going to be all right, Vivian said. She just needs consistency. I know, he said. There was something rough in it, something that came from a man who knew what his child needed and had been failing to provide it not through lack of love, but through the specific helplessness of grief. I've been trying. I know you have, she said. The house didn't keep itself. He nodded once and went back to his breakfast, and she thought, there. That was the first honest moment between them. Sparse, undecorated, nothing like a romance. Exactly like a beginning. It was on the 8th day that she first heard Douglas Hale's name again, and not in a pleasant context. She'd walked into the dry goods in town with Pearl, who'd decided, without being asked, to come along. They'd needed flour, lamp oil, and a spool of blue thread that Vivian intended to use on the sitting room curtains, which had been deteriorating quietly for what looked like a full winter. The woman behind the counter was named Mrs. Alcott, 60s, sharp-eyed, the kind of woman who held a town's institutional memory. She'd been polite to Vivian on her first visit, careful polite, the polite of someone reserving judgment, but today she seemed to have reached a decision because she leaned across the counter and said quietly, while Pearl was looking at a jar of hard candy near the window, I want to tell you something about the situation you've come into, Miss Carter, because I don't think Colton's told you everything. Vivian went still. What situation? Mrs. Alcott glanced toward Pearl, lowered her voice further. Douglas Hale has been trying to buy Colton's land for 2 years. He owns the water rights on the north side of the creek, and Colton's east pasture is the only thing standing between Hale's property and a clear run-through to the rail depot. He's offered twice. Colton said no both times. She paused. A month ago, Hale's lawyer sent a letter claiming Colton doesn't meet the homestead requirements, that the property isn't being maintained as a working family homestead. Vivian set down the spool of thread. Is that a legal concern? The territory's got provisions about what constitutes a proper homestead, Mrs. Alcott said. Man living alone, no family operation, property that looks abandoned. There have been cases where land claims were challenged on those grounds, usually by men with money to hire the right lawyers. Vivian was quiet for a moment. When's the hearing? February 15th. Mrs. Alcott looked at her steadily. 6 weeks. Pearl had turned away from the candy jar and was watching them both with the attentive silence of a child who understands more than adults give her credit for. Vivian picked up the thread. I'll take the flour, the lamp oil, and this thread, she said. And 3 of those peppermint sticks, please. Mrs. Alcott's face held the question she wasn't asking. We have work to do, Vivian said. Best to get started. She didn't confront Colton that evening. She thought about it, thought hard, but she'd been watching him for 8 days and she knew something about how he handled things he was ashamed of, which was that he went quiet and turned practical. The way men who've been hurt learn to keep moving because if they stop, they might not start again. She wasn't going to add shame to his plate on top of everything else. What she did instead was open his account book. She asked him directly at the kitchen table after supper, while Pearl slept. I want to understand the ranch's finances, she said. I'm not going to judge. I need to understand what we're working with. He looked at her for a long moment. Why? Because I'm here to help, she said, and I can't help if I don't know the truth. Another long moment. Then he got up, went to the shelf above the fireplace, and brought her a battered ledger book with a cracked spine. She opened it. The numbers were bad, not catastrophically, but the accumulated effect of 2 winters of single-handed operation, a reduced herd, medical costs from his wife's illness, and a few debts still outstanding. She made no sound while she read. She turned pages slowly. I've been managing, he said. I was standing by the fire with his arms crossed, and he said it like a man who knows the words aren't entirely true, but needs to say them anyway. I can see you have, she said. She turned another page. This is more than one man should have been carrying. He didn't say anything to that. She closed the book. She set it on the table between them. Mr. Briggs, she said, I think you should tell me about Douglas Hale. The fire popped. Outside, the wind came up under the eaves. He looked at her. She looked back. And then, slowly, tiredly, like a man setting down something he'd been carrying too long in the wrong way, he sat down and started talking. The Hale situation was worse than Mrs. Alcott had described, though not wildly more complicated. Hale wanted the land because the land was valuable. The east pasture ran along a natural watercourse and connected, through 2 other small properties he'd already absorbed, to a much larger grazing claim he was trying to consolidate. He'd been methodical about it, patient. He'd bought out one neighbor with a fair price, another with pressure, and a third, old man Prewitt, 67 and in poor health, with a land note that had terms built in to fail within 18 months. Colton had refused twice and received a lawyer's letter 3 weeks later suggesting his homestead claim was procedurally deficient. The letter cited the territory's requirement that a homestead demonstrate evidence of active family habitation, continuous improvement, and sustainable agricultural operation. He was a widower with a silent child, a deteriorating house, and numbers that barely made sense in a good month. He timed it, Vivian said. Colton looked at her. What? The letter. He sent it after your wife died, after your worst winter. He waited until you were at your lowest point. She said it without heat, just observing. That's not a man making a business decision. That's a man who watches and waits. Colton's jaw tightened. I know what kind of man he is. Did you know before I arrived that this hearing was coming? A pause. Yes. She felt something, not quite anger, more like the tight feeling of something being confirmed. Is that why you placed the advertisement? The question hung in the room like smoke. He looked at the fire for a long time. When he looked back at her, his eyes were honest in the way that costs something. Partly, he said. I needed. I thought if there was a family here, proper, that it might help with the legal situation. He stopped, started again. But it's not only that. Pearl needs... Another stop. He pressed his mouth shut, tried a third time. I was lonely, he said. That part was true too. It was possibly the most vulnerable thing she'd ever watched a man say. She looked at him for a moment. You should have told me, she said. In the letters. I know. I would have come anyway, she said. I want you to know that. What I was running from in Omaha was worse than what I would have found here, even knowing the full picture. But I would have preferred to know. He nodded, looked at his hands. Are you... He stopped. No, she said, and she surprised herself by meaning it. I'm not leaving. Whatever I walked into it. That's not how I operate. She pulled the ledger back toward her. Now, tell me everything you've done on this property in the last 2 years. Every fence post, every improvement, every repair. And we're going to write it down. He blinked. Tonight? Is there something more important? He thought about that for a moment. Then he got up and put another log on the fire. I fixed the north fence in April, he said, right after the thaw. She opened to a clean page and picked up the pencil. Start from the beginning, she said. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest Vivian had worked in her life, and she had worked hard her whole life. She was up before dawn most days, not because anyone required it, but because there was so much to do and she'd never been someone who could sleep when a problem was sitting unsolved. The kitchen garden had to be planned for spring. The household records had to be organized. The list of improvements had to be documented properly, with dates confirmed through whatever evidence existed, receipts from the feed store, letters, Pete the wagon driver's memory of deliveries he'd made. She walked the fence line with Colton on a Saturday in late January, the ground frozen solid under her boots, and he pointed out every repair he'd made and she wrote them in a small notebook with fingers so cold she could barely hold the pencil. You don't have to do all this, he said, watching her write. I know I don't have to, she said. Why are you? She finished the entry. North pasture fence, 17 posts replaced, wire restrung, November, and looked up at him. The sky behind him was the particular white-gray of a winter that isn't done with you yet. Because it's my home too, she said. It's been 3 weeks and it's already my home. I don't explain that any better than that. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face was doing something she couldn't quite name. She filed it away. Pearl had developed a habit of following Vivian around in the mornings. She didn't always talk. Sometimes she just sat in the same room while Vivian worked, dragging a rag doll she'd named Clara by one arm. But she'd started talking more. Asked questions about cooking, about the Cedar Cradle, about Vivian's sister Margaret, whom she seemed to find fascinating in a serious, childlike way. Did it hurt? Pearl asked one morning. When she died? Vivian was cutting potatoes. She didn't look up. Yes, very much. Did you cry? A lot? Pearl was quiet. I cried a lot too, she said. Papa didn't want to cry in front of me. I could hear him at night sometimes. Vivian set down the knife. That sounds like a hard thing to carry by yourself. Yeah. Pearl twisted Clara's arm thoughtfully. Are you sad now? Vivian considered the question honestly. Some days, she said, but not as much as I was. Being useful helps. Pearl seemed to find this satisfactory. She went back to Clara. 2 weeks before the hearing, Douglas Hale rode onto the property. Vivian saw him first. She was in the yard with a basket of laundry she'd just pulled from the line. Still slightly damp, the cold had been relentless. And she recognized his horse before she recognized him. That particular bay, well-fed and overgroomed, the kind of animal that reflected its owner's vanity. She stood in the yard and watched him approach. He reined in about 10 feet from her, looked around the property with the systematic gaze of a man taking inventory. The new fence posts visible along the south line, the woodpile, considerably higher than it had been, the kitchen garden, raked and turned under burlap for the winter but clearly tended, the house, which still needed paint but had new glass in the east window and fresh chinking between the logs. He looked at her. She looked at him. Miss Carter, he said, like they'd met before in pleasant circumstances. Mr. Hale, she said, like they hadn't. He smiled. You've been busy. Most people are? I meant with the property. He glanced around again. Someone's been paying attention. Several someones, she said. That's how a family operation works. He studied her for a moment. I want to be frank with you. By all means. Colton Briggs is not a bad man, Hale said. He's just a man who's in over his head. He's got debt, he's got a struggling operation, and he's got a legal claim that, he tilted his head, may or may not hold up under scrutiny. What I'm offering him is a fair price, more than fair. He could pay his debts, take his daughter somewhere easier, start over. He's already starting over, Vivian said. We both are. Here. Hale looked at her steadily. You've been here less than a month. That's correct. Don't you think it's a little, he seemed to choose the word, premature to be making decisions for the long term? I'm not making decisions for the long term, she said. I'm making them for now. The long term takes care of itself when the now is right. He let that sit for a moment. Something shifted in his expression, very slight. The recalibration of a man who thought he was coming to talk to someone movable and is realizing he isn't. Mrs. Briggs isn't actually your legal name, he said pleasantly. Not yet, she said. Not yet, he repeated. Vivian said nothing. She picked up her laundry basket. A word of advice, Hale said. Woman to situation. Whatever arrangement you and Colton have made, I'd think carefully about whether it's worth tying yourself to something that's already... Thank you for coming by, Mr. Hale, she said. She walked toward the house. I'll let Colton know you visited. She went inside. She set the basket down. She stood in the kitchen for about 30 seconds with her hands flat on the table, breathing slowly. Then she started folding laundry. Colton found her there when he came in from the barn for noon. She told him about the visit. He stood in the middle of the kitchen and listened without interrupting, which she'd come to understand was how he handled serious things. When she finished, he said, What did you say to him? Not much, she said. I let him talk. I didn't give him anything. Good, he said. There was a silence. He mentioned the legal name thing, she said carefully. About Mrs. Briggs. Colton looked at the floor. Something moved across his face. He was quiet for a long time. Vivian, he started. Don't, she said, not unkindly. Don't make it sound like you're about to ask me to do something for you. Don't frame it like that. He stopped. If it makes sense legally and practically, she said, then we should discuss it practically. As two adults who have been making practical decisions together for 3 weeks. She folded a shirt, set it down. I'm not opposed. That's what I'm telling you. If you need to hear it. He looked at her for a long time. You do that. I'm not doing it for you, she said. I'm doing it because this is my home and I don't intend to let Douglas Hale take it. There's a difference. He nodded, very slowly. There is, he said. So, she said. She picked up another shirt. We should have probably talked to whoever does marriages in this county. He was quiet again. Then he said, almost to himself, the last time I was there, it was for a different kind of reason. I know, she said. I'm sorry for that. He looked at her. His eyes were tired and steady, and something underneath the tired that she recognized because she'd felt it herself in Omaha, in that rented room. The look of someone who has lost so much they've become afraid to hold anything new too tightly in case it goes too. Thank you, he said, for all of this. For being... He stopped. Seemed frustrated with his own words. You didn't have to be this. Nobody has to be anything, she said. People choose. He nodded once. He turned toward the door to go back out to the barn. Colton, she said. He stopped. The cradle, she said. I'd like to put it on the shelf in the main room, if you don't mind. He turned back, and for a moment she saw something on his face she couldn't quite name but recognized as precious. The sitting room shelf? He said. Yes, that's... He seemed to search for the right word and couldn't find it. Yeah, he said. That's where it should be. He went back out. She listened to the door close, and to the quiet of the house settling around her, and to Pearl somewhere in the back room talking to Clara about something important and incomprehensible. She folded the last shirt. She put it on the pile. She went to get the cedar cradle. The hearing was 13 days away. There was still so much to do. But for the first time since Omaha, she didn't feel like she was doing it alone. The cedar cradle sat on the sitting room shelf like it had always been there. Vivian noticed it every morning when she came through to start the fire. The way the early light caught the grain of the wood, the careful dovetail joints her brother-in-law had cut before he'd left Margaret and left the cradle behind as the only thing of value in that rented room. She didn't think about Margaret every time she saw it anymore. Some mornings, she just saw a well-made thing on a shelf in a house that was starting to feel like hers, and that felt like progress of a kind she hadn't expected. Pearl had taken to touching it when she passed. Just the side, 2 fingers, the same way she had that first day in the kitchen. She never asked about it anymore. She'd absorbed it into the furniture of her daily life, which Vivian thought was exactly what should happen with objects that carry grief. You don't put them away. You let them become ordinary. The hearing was 13 days away when she put the cradle on the shelf. By the time it had been there a week, it was 11 days, and the notebook she'd been filling since that first frozen fence line walk was nearly full. Colton had never been a man who talked about what he was doing while he was doing it. Vivian had figured that out in the first week. He communicated in actions. The extra wood stacked by the kitchen door before a storm she hadn't known was coming. The way he repaired the cellar latch without being asked because he'd seen her struggle with it twice. These were a language she understood because she spoke it herself, but it made the distances between them strange and quiet in ways she was still learning to read. What she hadn't expected was how much Pearl filled those distances. The child had opened up the way a window opens in spring, gradually, then all at once, and then you couldn't imagine the room without the air moving through it. She talked at breakfast about things she'd dreamed. She asked Colton questions about the cattle with a seriousness that made him answer carefully, as though he was reporting to a small but exacting supervisor. She had opinions about the color of thread Vivian should use on the curtains. Blue, she insisted, not the green Vivian had initially considered, and she'd been right, which Vivian told her plainly, which made Pearl stand up straighter for the rest of the afternoon. She was not a simple child. She was a child who'd been very sad for a long time and was slowly remembering she didn't have to be. Vivian knew something about that particular process, and she tried to give it room without pushing. One evening, about a week after Hale's visit, Vivian was at the table working through the property documentation, receipts organized by date, a written account of each improvement cross-referenced with whatever physical evidence she could attach to it. When Pearl appeared in the doorway in her nightgown, Clara under one arm. "Can't sleep," Pearl said. "Come sit," Vivian said. Pearl climbed into the chair across from her and watched Vivian write for a while. "What are you doing?" "Writing down everything your father has done to improve this ranch," Vivian said. "Every fence post, every repair, every acre cleared, so we can show the court." Pearl looked at the papers. "Because of Mr. Hale." Vivian looked up. She hadn't known Pearl knew that name. "Yes." "Papa doesn't like him," Pearl said. "He doesn't say it, but I can tell." She adjusted Claire's position thoughtfully. "Mr. Hale came here once before you came. He and Papa stood in the yard and talked, and then Papa came inside and didn't eat dinner." "When was that?" Pearl considered. "Before Christmas, when the snow came early." She looked at the papers again. "Is he going to take our house?" Vivian put down the pencil. She looked at Pearl the way she'd learned to look at her, directly, without softening it too much, because Pearl could smell condescension from 20 feet, and she didn't tolerate it. "Not if I can help it," she said. Pearl looked at her for a long moment. "Okay," she said. Then, "Can I have some water?" "Yes," Vivian said, and got up to get it. The conversation with Colton about the marriage happened on a Thursday, which was not a day either of them would have planned for it. They talked around it since Hale's visit, practically, sensibly, the way they approached most things, but the actual sitting down and deciding had been postponed by a sick heifer, a broken wagon axle, and 3 days of weather so severe that going to town was simply not reasonable. The Thursday the weather broke, they both knew it. He came in for dinner at midday, stamping mud off his boots, and she had the documentation notebook on the table and a pot of stew on the stove, and they looked at each other across the kitchen and both understood that the practical conversation had arrived. "I talked to Pete," he said, hanging his coat. Pete, she'd learned, was not only a wagon driver but the son of the county recorder, and therefore the fastest path to any number of pieces of administrative information. Justice of the peace in Harlan Creek can do a legal marriage. It takes a witness and a fee. Nothing else required. "All right," she said. He sat down at the table, looked at the notebook. How's it coming? Better than I expected, she said. You kept receipts for most of the major purchases. That helps. She sat across from him. There are gaps where I'm relying on your word and Pete's memory of deliveries, but I think the overall picture is solid. If the judge is honest, it should be enough. If, he said. Yes, she said. If. He looked out the window. The sky had gone pale and cold and clear, the kind of clear that follows bad weather and doesn't make promises about what comes next. Hale's got money, he said. Money buys lawyers. Lawyers find angles. I know, she said. That's why the documentation has to be airtight, and the homestead has to look like what it actually is. He looked back at her. Which is what? A family operation that's been improving steadily under difficult circumstances, she said. Which it is. We just have to show that clearly. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Vivian, the marriage. He stopped, tried again. I want to be straight with you. I know I should have been straighter from the beginning about the legal situation. I wasn't, and I'm not going to pretend it wasn't right. He pressed his hand flat on the table. But I don't want you to go through with this because you feel trapped. I didn't bring you here to trap you. She looked at him. She'd been expecting something like this. The conscience of a basically decent man catching up to him. She wasn't annoyed by it. She thought it was actually the most Colton Briggs thing he'd done yet. Yet you're not trapping me, she said. I'm a grown woman who's made decisions in harder situations than this one. If I felt trapped, I'd say so. She paused. I do want something from you in return. He waited. Honesty going forward, she said. All of it. Even when it's uncomfortable. Even when you think I'd rather not know. No more letters that leave out the essential problem. He held her gaze. Fair, he said. All right then. She stood up to check the stew. We should go to town tomorrow morning. Beat the mud before it freezes again. He nodded. She stirred the stew. Outside, somewhere near the barn, Pearl was calling to one of the barn cats in a tone that suggested the cat was not cooperating, which was likely. Vivian, he said. She turned. He looked like he was going to say something and then changed his mind about what it was. Thank you, he said finally, which was probably not what he'd started to say, but she didn't press it. Eat your stew, she said. The justice of the peace in Harlan Creek was a man named Edgar Foss, who was 71 years old and had officiated so many frontier marriages that he conducted the whole business with the efficiency of someone processing grain. Pete came as witness, which he seemed to find moderately interesting, and Mrs. Alcott appeared, uninvited but unsurprised to be there, and stood near the door with her hands folded. Pearl was there because they hadn't been able to think of a reason not to bring her, and also because not bringing her would have required an explanation that seemed more complicated than her presence. The ceremony was 4 minutes. Foss said the words, Colton said yes, Vivian said yes. Pete signed the paper, Mrs. Alcott signed the paper, and that was that. Colton shook Foss's hand. Vivian shook Foss's hand. Pearl shook Foss's hand with great seriousness because she'd watched the adults do it and understood it was required. Outside on the street afterward, Pearl looked between them and said, Are you different now? Legally, Vivian said. Pearl considered this. You don't look different. People generally don't, Vivian said. Colton was looking at the street. He had an expression she couldn't entirely read, something between settled and uncertain, like a man who'd done the right thing and wasn't sure yet what it was going to cost him. She understood that. She felt it herself, in a quieter way. They'd made a practical decision. Practical decisions didn't always feel clean in the immediate aftermath. Mrs. Alcott pressed Vivian's hand before she left. You're a steady woman, she said quietly. This town has needed steady. Vivian thanked her. They walked back to the wagon, the three of them, Pearl holding Vivian's hand because the street was icy in the shaded spots. It was not a romantic morning, but it was a real one, which she'd decided long ago was worth more. But what she hadn't anticipated was how the town would respond. She'd expected neutrality or mild goodwill, or perhaps the kind of polite but watchful reception that small communities give to newcomers who haven't yet proven themselves. What she got instead was something more practical and considerably more useful. It started with Jim Calloway, who owned the 40 acres north of Colton's East Pasture and had been watching Hale's land consolidation with the specific anxiety of a man who knows he's probably next. He appeared at their door on a Saturday with a wagon load of split wood and the information that he'd been keeping his own records of Hale's activities in the area, property transactions, visits from the lawyer, conversations overheard at the feed store, because he'd had a feeling it would matter someday. He and Colton stood in the yard talking for an hour while Vivian listened from the kitchen window, not because she was hiding, but because the window was where she was working and the voices carried clearly. He got Prewitt's note called in last month, Calloway said. Old man had nowhere to go. His nephew in Denver took him in, but it was... He shook his head. Hale's lawyer said it was just a business arrangement gone bad. But we all know what it was. You'd testify to that? Colton asked. At the hearing? A pause. Yeah, Calloway said. I would. And I know 2 others who might. Vivian set down what she was doing and wrote that in the notebook. After Calloway came the Swanson brothers, who ran the feed store and had receipts going back 4 years of Colton's purchases. Evidence of a continuous, active ranching operation that directly contradicted Hale's claim of an abandoned or deteriorating homestead. Then came a woman named Ruth Marsh, who'd been friends with Colton's first wife and had quietly been watching the ranch from a distance since the funeral, with the particular concern of someone who doesn't want to intrude but hasn't stopped paying attention. Ruth came with a jar of preserves and stayed for 3 hours. And by the time she left, she'd agreed to provide a written statement about the condition of the property as she'd observed it over 2 years. Vivian hadn't asked for any of this. She'd gone to town, done her shopping, been direct and unfussy in every interaction, and somehow that had been enough to communicate something to the people of Harlan Creek that 3 weeks of living quietly on the ranch had built without her quite realizing it. They trust you, Colton said one evening. He was at the table watching her organize the new materials she'd collected. Statements, receipts, Calloway's notes. More than they trust me, maybe. No offense to myself. They trust the work, she said. They can see what's happening out here. People in small towns notice more than you think. Hale's been here longer than you, he said. He's got money, and he buys things from these same people. There's a difference between doing business with someone and trusting them, she said. Hale's money is useful to them. We're just people. She paused. Sometimes just people is what holds. Colton was quiet. He picked up one of Calloway's written notes and read it. He mentioned Prewitt, he said. Hale got his land through a bad note. I wondered. He set the paper down. Prewitt sold me my first breeding pair of cattle, 20 years ago, when I was 20 and had nothing. He didn't ask for the money right away because he could see I didn't have it. I was looking at the table. 67 years old, and his nephew had to take him in. I know, Vivian said. I should have done something, he said. What would you have done? She said, not unkindly. You were managing a dead wife's estate and a silent child in a struggling operation. You're not responsible for every wrong in this territory. I'm not saying I am, he said. I'm saying... He stopped. You're saying it makes you angry, she said. Yes, he said. Good, she said. Hold on to that. We're going to need it. He looked at her. Something moved across his face, something that wasn't quite a smile but was adjacent to it. You're a practical woman, he said. I've been called worse, she said, and went back to organizing the papers. 8 days before this hearing, she made a mistake. She'd been pushing hard on the documentation for 2 weeks straight, and she was tired in a way she hadn't fully admitted to herself. The kind of tired that lives in the shoulders and behind the eyes and makes you impatient with things that don't deserve impatience. She was at the kitchen table in the late afternoon, cross-checking the fence repair dates against Pete's delivery records, and Pearl came in from outside with muddy boots and tracked across the clean floor without noticing, and Vivian said, sharper than she meant to, Pearl, boots. Pearl stopped, looked at her feet, looked at the floor. Her face went carefully blank in the particular way it went when she was trying to decide whether she was in trouble. I'm sorry, Pearl said quietly. I forgot. I know, Vivian said, and then, I'm sorry. I said that too hard. She set down the pencil. I'm tired, and I took it out on you. That wasn't fair. Pearl looked at her. Children. Pearl's age didn't always know what to do with direct apologies from adults because they didn't receive them that often. She stood in the doorway in her muddy boots and looked uncertain. It's okay, she said finally. Boots by the door, Vivian said. And then come in and I'll put the kettle on. Pearl went back to the door and removed her boots. Then she came in sock-footed and sat at the table and watched Vivian fill the kettle. Are you scared? Pearl asked. Vivian put the kettle on the stove. About the hearing? Yeah. She thought about it. Some, she said, but being scared and doing the thing anyway that's just how you do hard things. Pearl pulled at a loose thread on her sleeve. Papa was scared when I had the fever last winter, she said. He sat by my bed and he kept squeezing my hand, but he didn't leave, not once. Vivian looked at her. He told you that? No, Pearl said. I remember. I wasn't all the way asleep. She looked up. He didn't leave. No, Vivian said. I don't think he would. Pearl nodded as though this confirmed something she'd already been fairly sure of. He won't leave now either, she said. About the house. He's not the leaving kind. Vivian looked at this small, serious child at her kitchen table and felt something she hadn't expected, something that sat in her chest like warmth and ached a little at the same time, the way good things sometimes do when you've been without them for a while. No, she said. I don't think he is. It was 6 days before the hearing when Hale made his second move, and this one was less subtle than a visit. Colton came in from town mid-afternoon, which was unusual for him, and the set of his shoulders when he came through the door told her. Before his face did that something had happened. He had a folded paper in his hand that he set on the table. Hale's lawyer filed an additional claim, he said. Filed it yesterday with the territorial court. He's added a challenge to the validity of the marriage. He tapped the paper. Claims it was performed solely for the purpose of satisfying homestead requirements and constitutes a fraudulent representation to the court. Vivian looked at this paper. She didn't pick it up. He's claiming the marriage isn't real. Yes. She was quiet for a moment, thinking. Can he do that? Apparently he can claim it. Whether it holds is another question. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down heavily. His lawyer is good. This is a stall. Even if it doesn't succeed, it forces our lawyer to respond to it, takes up preparation time, complicates the presentation at the hearing. Do we have a lawyer? She said. He looked at her. A pause. I was hoping Mrs. Alcott's son-in-law, Colton. He's a fair man. Colton, does he have a license to practice in territorial court? A shorter pause. He's familiar with the procedures. Vivian pressed her hands flat on the table and looked at the ceiling briefly. This was new information she did not love. All right, she said. How much time do we have before the hearing? 6 days. Then we need to talk to whoever is available in 6 days who can actually stand in front of a territorial judge. She stood up. Pete's father works at the county recorder's office. Does he know anyone? I can ask. Ask today, she said. Right now, before it gets dark. She picked up the paper and read it. Hale's lawyer had neat handwriting and a way of making accusations sound like regretful observations. She set it back down. The fraudulent marriage claim, she said. They'd need to show intent to deceive the court. Can they show that? They'd argue the timing, Colton said. Marriage 2 weeks before the hearing, with a justice of the peace, a witness, a county record, and a woman who's been living and working the property for over a month, she said. That's not a fraud. That's a marriage between two people who had practical reasons to formalize something that was already... She stopped. He looked at her. Already real, she said. A silence. It is real, he said. She looked at him. He wasn't being strategic. He wasn't making a legal argument. He was just saying it quietly, across the table, with that same honest look he got when something was costing him something. Yes, she said. It is. She picked up her coat. Go see Pete's father, she said. I'm going to go talk to Mrs. Alcott about the son-in-law. Maybe he knows someone. He stood up. He was standing close to her in the small kitchen, and he seemed to become aware of it because he took a half step back, the way he always did when the space got too honest too fast. Vivian, she paused. For what it's worth, he said. I know this wasn't what you signed up for. All of this. I know. He stopped again. That frustrated expression of a man who could build a fence in his sleep and couldn't build a sentence when it mattered. It's more than you agreed to. She looked at him for a moment. He was right. It was more than she'd agreed to. She'd agreed to partnership and practical arrangement and a fair life in a difficult place, and what she'd gotten was a land war, a fraudulent marriage claim, 6 days until a hearing, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, a family that had started to feel real. "Most things worth doing are more than you agreed to," she said. "That's not a complaint. That's just how it goes." She went out. He followed, heading to the barn to saddle his horse. Pearl, who had been sitting on the porch step in her coat listening to none of this and all of it, looked up at Vivian as she passed. "Is it bad?" Pearl asked. "It's a problem," Vivian said. "We're going to fix it." "Okay," Pearl said. Just that. The same thing she'd said the night of the documentation work, in the same tone, not entirely convinced but deciding to believe it anyway, which Vivian thought was the most honest form of hope she'd ever encountered. She walked down the porch steps and toward town, the cold air hitting her face, the late light going flat and gray across the frozen ground. 11 years ago, she'd watched her parents' house sell at auction because her father had trusted the wrong man with a note. She'd been 17. She'd stood on the road outside and watched strangers carry things out of the house where she'd been born, and she'd made herself a promise. She would never be the person who stood on the road and watched. She would be the person who did something, even if the something was imperfect, even if it cost her, even if she was the only one doing it. She had never broken that promise. She didn't intend to start now. Behind her, the light was on in the kitchen window. Pearl had gone back inside. The cedar cradle was on the shelf in the sitting room, where it had always belonged. Vivian walked faster. Mrs. Alcott's son-in-law was named Gerald Pruitt, and he was not a bad man, but he was also not quite what the situation required. Vivian understood this within the first 10 minutes of sitting across from him at Mrs. Alcott's kitchen table that evening. Gerald was 34, earnest, and had passed his territorial bar examination on the third attempt, which he mentioned with the particular defensiveness of someone who mentions it before you can ask. He had handled 2 property disputes in the county, both of which had settled before reaching a judge, and he spoke about territorial court procedure with just enough hesitation that she could tell he was pulling from reading rather than experience. He was, however, available. He was willing. And he was not going to charge them anything, which Mrs. Alcott announced with the tone of someone presenting an argument that should end the discussion. Vivian looked at the papers Gerald had spread on the table. Hale's lawyer's additional filing, the original homestead challenge, the procedural calendar for the February 15th hearing. Gerald had read them all carefully. He'd made notes in a small, cramped hand in the margins. "The fraudulent marriage claim is weak," Gerald said. "As a standalone argument, the timing is circumstantial and the burden of proof is on them to show intent to deceive. But it's not nothing. It gives the judge something to consider. And if their primary argument about homestead compliance is also marginal, the two together could create reasonable doubt about the validity of the claim." "What's their primary argument?" Vivian asked. "That the homestead hasn't met the continuous improvement standard," he said. "They'll present evidence, or what they call evidence, that the property was in a state of neglect following Mrs. Briggs's death. Deteriorating structures, reduced herd size, failure to cultivate, all of which was true at certain points," Colton said. He was sitting beside Vivian, his hat on his knee, his jaw set. He said it flatly, without apology, because he'd decided somewhere between the ride to town and this kitchen table that the truth was going to be told straight. Vivian had noticed the decision without commenting on it. "Which is why the counter-documentation matters," Gerald said. He looked at the notebook Vivian had brought. "May I?" She slid it across to him. He opened it and read in silence for a while, turning pages slowly. His eyebrows rose twice. "You cross-referenced the fence repairs with the feed store receipts," he said. "Yes," she said. "And these statements from Calloway and the Swanson brothers, you obtained these yourself?" "They came forward," she said. "I organized them." Gerald looked up at her. "Mrs. Briggs, this is—" He stopped, looked at the notebook again. "This is better than what most lawyers would have assembled in 6 days." "We've had more than 6 days," she said. "We've had 6 weeks of living here and working. I just wrote it down." He looked at Colton. Colton looked back at him with an expression that said, "Yes, I know, I know." "All right," Gerald said. He closed the notebook carefully. "Here's where we stand. The homestead case I think we can win on the documentation alone, especially with community witnesses. The fraudulent marriage claim," he paused. "They'll want to argue that the marriage was entered into solely as a legal maneuver. The best counterargument is demonstration that the marriage represents an ongoing, legitimate domestic arrangement, not a legal fiction. It isn't a legal fiction, Colton said. I know that, Gerald said. The court needs to know that, which means he folded his hands on the table. Both of you will need to speak. Not just present documents. Actually speak. Answer questions about how you met, about the correspondence, about the arrangement, about what the past 6 weeks have looked like in practice. A silence. They'll be looking for inconsistencies, Gerald said. Places where the story doesn't hold together. So the story needs to be the truth, told clearly, without embellishment. Vivian looked at Colton. I was looking at the table. That shouldn't be difficult, she said. The truth is what it is. Colton looked up. His eyes met hers. Something passed between them. Not quite a question and not quite an answer. No, he said. It shouldn't be. They drove home in the dark, the three of them. Colton handling the reins, Vivian beside him on the bench, Pearl asleep in the wagon bed, wrapped in the heavy blanket Vivian had put there before they left, because she'd known the child would fall asleep before they got back. The road was frozen hard enough to be smooth, and the sky was very clear, the kind of clear that meant morning would be cold enough to crack your knuckles just walking to the barn. Vivian sat with her hands in her lap and watched the road and thought. Gerald's going to be all right, she said. Colton kept his eyes on the road. He's green. He's careful, she said, which matters more in this situation than experience. An experienced lawyer who's careless loses cases just as fast. He was quiet for a moment. You're being generous. I'm being accurate, she said. There's a difference. She paused. He understood the documentation immediately. He'll know how to present it. And the marriage question, Colton said. She watched the road. We answer it honestly. I know, he said. I'm not worried about lying. He stopped, started again. I'm not sure how to explain something I don't entirely understand myself. She looked at him. The sight of his face in the dark, the set of his jaw, the way he held the reins with the particular tension of a man trying to think clearly about something that doesn't quite fit in his head yet. You don't have to understand it perfectly to describe it accurately, she said. You just say what happened, what you did, what I did, what Pearl said that night at the table. That's all. What did Pearl say that night? He asked. She asked if you were different now that we were married, Vivian said. And I said legally. And she said we didn't look different. He made a sound, not quite a laugh, something quieter. That's Pearl. Yes, Vivian said. They drove in silence for a while. In the wagon bed, Pearl made a small sound and shifted under the blanket and went still again. She's doing better, he said. Not a question, but offered like one. She is, Vivian said. She's a resilient child. She just needed consistency. Her mother was consistent, he said. Ellen was... She was steady. The way you're steady. He said it the way men say things that come out more than they intended, and then he went quiet as though he was waiting to see how it landed. Vivian let it sit for a moment. I'm sorry you lost her, she said. I am too, he said. They drove the rest of the way home without talking, which was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that exists between people who've said something real and are giving it room. The 5 days before the hearing had a quality she couldn't quite name. Not dread, not anticipation, more like the particular pressure that builds before a thing you've been preparing for and can no longer fully prepare for. She'd done what she could with the documentation. Gerald came out twice to go over the sequence of presentation, to walk her and Colton through the kinds of questions Hale's lawyer would ask, to practice the clear and unembellished telling of the truth. The first practice session was rough. Colton answered questions with the terseness of a man who'd spent 2 years not talking about personal things, and Gerald had to keep coaxing him back to specifics. Not just, she handles the house, Colton. Tell me what she did last Tuesday. Give me the particular thing. And Colton would look frustrated and then look at Vivian and then try again. She was not much better. She was precise and organized and could describe the documentation in her sleep. But when Gerald asked her about why she'd answered the advertisement, the personal why, the real one, she found herself giving the legal answer and not the true one, and Gerald caught it. That's the practical reason, he said. I need the human reason. She looked at him. Those are the same. They're not, he said, not unkindly. The practical reason is that you needed a fresh start. The human reason is what you were carrying when you got on that train. The court isn't going to be persuaded by efficiency. They're going to be looking at two people and asking whether what they're seeing is real. He paused. So I need you to tell me about your sister. The kitchen was quiet. Colton was watching her from across the table. She didn't like this. She was aware that she didn't like it, and aware that disliking it didn't change its necessity, which was the particular position she'd found herself in most of her adult life. My sister Margaret died in March, she said. She'd been sick for 3 years. I nursed her. When she died, I had no money and no family left, and a landlord who wanted the room back. She stopped. I answered the advertisement because it said honest terms, honest life, because I'd been living with a lot of things that were neither, and because she stopped again. Gerald waited. Because the cedar cradle in the corner belonged to her, she said, and I couldn't leave it in that room, and I needed somewhere to take it where there might be room for it to mean something different than it meant in Omaha. She looked at the table. That's the human reason. The kitchen was very quiet. Gerald nodded slowly. That's what you say to the court, he said. Exactly that. She looked up. Colton was looking at her with an expression she'd not seen on him before, open in a way he usually wasn't, like something had come down that he normally kept up. I didn't know that part, he said, about the cradle. You didn't ask, she said. Not as an accusation, just a fact. No, he said. I didn't. A pause. I should have. She looked at him. You know it now, she said. The second practice session went better. Colton had clearly been thinking about specificity because he answered Gerald's questions with a precision that surprised both of them. Dates, details. The particular morning he'd come in to find Pearl eating breakfast without coaxing, the fence line walk in January with Vivian writing in a frozen notebook. He described things the way a man describes things he's been paying closer attention to than he realized. Gerald seemed satisfied. He closed his notebook and said, One more thing. Hale's lawyer is a man named Caswell, Victor Caswell. He works out of Cheyenne and he's good at what he does, which is finding the emotional weak point in a story and pressing on it until something breaks. He'll be polite, he'll be reasonable. He'll ask questions that sound like they're on your side until you realize they aren't. He looked at Colton. Don't lose your temper with him. Colton's jaw tightened. I won't. You might want to, Gerald said. Don't. Colton said nothing. And you, Gerald said to Vivian. He'll try to make you sound calculating, like you came here with a plan to position yourself legally. He'll use your organizational work against you, all this documentation, the precision of it, and make it sound like manipulation instead of competence. What do I do with that? She said. Tell the truth, Gerald said. Same as everything else. You organized what existed. You didn't invent it. No, she said. I didn't. After Gerald left that evening, Colton stood by the fire for a long time without talking. Pearl had gone to bed. The house was quiet. Vivian was at the table going through the documentation one more time, not because it needed it, but because her hands needed something to do. I want to say something, Colton said. She looked up. He turned from the fire. He was holding his hat in both hands, the way he did when he was working up to something. When I placed that advertisement, he said, I told myself it was purely practical, that I needed help with Pearl, help with the ranch, and the legal situation made it. He stopped. I wasn't lying, but I wasn't being fully honest with myself either, about what I was hoping for. She waited. I don't know how to say this without it sounding like I'm making it bigger than it is, he said, or smaller. I keep landing in the wrong place when I try to say it. Then just say the thing itself, she said. He looked at her. I think you're the most capable person I've ever met, he said. And I know that sounds like a practical compliment, but I don't mean it practically. I mean it the way you mean something that's... He stopped again. I wake up in the mornings and there's a light on in the kitchen, he said. And that's different. That's something I didn't know I'd lost until it came back. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the documentation spread on the table. She looked at the cedar cradle on the shelf. She thought about Margaret and the rented room and the way hope feels different when you've been a long time without it. Not triumphant, more like a careful ache, a thing you hold gently because you've learned what careless holding costs. I'm not going anywhere, she said. Whatever happens at the hearing, I want you to know that. It's not contingent. He looked at her. Something in his face went very still. Not contingent, he repeated. No, she said. He nodded. Once, the way he nodded when something settled into place. He put his hat on this peg by the door. Get some sleep, he said. You've been up too late all week. In a while, she said. He went toward the back of the house, paused in the hallway. Vivian. Yes. The light in the mornings, he said. I didn't want you to think I didn't notice it. She heard him go down the hall. She heard his door close. She sat for a while longer at the table, the documentation spread around her, the cradle on the shelf catching the last of the firelight, and she thought, there it is again. That ache that isn't quite sorrow and isn't quite joy and is somehow both at once. She put out the lamp and went to bed. The morning of February 15th was the coldest of the winter. She knew it before she opened her eyes, the particular quality of silence that deep cold produces, the way sound changes when the temperature drops below what the air can comfortably hold. She lay still for a moment and then she got up, because lying still wasn't something she did when there was work ahead. She dressed carefully. She had one good dress, dark wool, well made, the one she'd bought in Omaha 2 years before Margaret got very sick, the one she hadn't worn since because there hadn't been an occasion that felt appropriate. She put it on. She did her hair the way Margaret had always liked it, which was neater than she usually bothered with, and looked at herself in the small mirror over the washstand and thought, you've done harder things than this. She wasn't sure that was true, but she thought it anyway. When she came out to the kitchen, Colton was already up, already dressed, his good shirt, his clean coat, the boots he'd polished the night before. He was standing at the stove with a cup of coffee, and when he looked at her, something shifted in his expression. Brief, quickly controlled, but she caught it. Coffee's hot, he said. Thank you, she said. Pearl appeared from the hallway, still in her nightgown, her hair loose, blinking. She looked at both of them, the good clothes, the particular stillness in the kitchen. Is today the day? She asked. Yes, Colton said. Pearl looked at Vivian. You look pretty, she said. Thank you, Vivian said. Go get dressed. You're coming with us. Pearl disappeared back down the hallway. Colton looked at Vivian. You sure about that? It might be. She should be there, Vivian said. The whole point is that this is a family. She's the family. He looked at her for a moment. Yes, he said. All right. They drank their coffee. They ate a little, not much. Neither of them had much appetite, which neither of them acknowledged. Pearl came back dressed in her blue wool with her hair braided, which she'd done herself and which was imperfect but sincere, and Vivian fixed the escaped strands at her temple without comment, while Pearl stood very still and cooperative. They drove to town. The territorial court hearing was held in the Harlan Creek Town Hall, which was also the space used for town meetings, occasional dances, and the annual agricultural fair judging, and which smelled faintly of all of these things. The room had been arranged with benches on either side and a table at the front where the judge, a compact gray-haired man named Horace Webb, who'd ridden up from the county seat the day before, sat with his papers. Vivian had not expected the room to be as full as it was. Calloway was there, in his good coat, sitting in the third row. The Swanson brothers were there. Ruth Marsh sat beside Mrs. Alcott near the wall. Pete had come, which surprised her. There were people she didn't know by name, faces she recognized from the dry goods, from the street, who had come to watch or to stand if asked. She had not asked them to come. She had asked Calloway and Ruth for statements. She had not asked anyone to show up in person. She looked at Mrs. Alcott, who caught her eye and gave the smallest nod, as though to say, this is how it works here, when it works. Douglas Hale was at the other table with Victor Caswell, who was exactly as Gerald had described, well-dressed, composed, the kind of careful that looks relaxed. Hale sat beside him with the studied ease of a man who is accustomed to outcomes going his way, though Vivian noticed, because she'd learned to notice these things about him, that his eyes moved across the room when he came in, taking stock, and that he spent a fraction of a second too long looking at the full benches before his expression settled back into ease. He hadn't expected this many people. That was useful. Pearl sat between Vivian and Colton on the respondent's bench, very straight, her hands in her lap. Vivian had told her, before they came in, that she didn't need to do anything except sit quietly, and Pearl had said okay in the tone she reserved for things she was taking seriously. Gerald was beside Colton, his papers organized neatly, his face composed in the particular way of someone who is prepared as well as they know how and is now committed to the outcome. Judge Webb called the room to order. Caswell opened with the homestead compliance argument, which he presented methodically and without apparent malice. A series of documented observations about the state of the Briggs property at various points following Ellen Briggs's death. Pieced together from a surveyor's report Hale had commissioned the previous spring. 2 neighbor statements that Vivian noted were from people she didn't recognize and suspected were not local, and a general characterization of reduced herd size and deferred maintenance. It was not an unfair account of what the property had looked like 8 months ago. That was the frustrating part. Hale hadn't fabricated anything. He'd just frozen the truth at the moment it suited him best. When Gerald stood to respond, he was steady. He presented the documentation in the order they'd organized it, chronological, specific, cross-referenced. He walked the judge through the fence repairs, the structural improvements, the kitchen garden preparation, the herd numbers as they stood now versus the low point of the previous spring. He entered the Swanson receipts into evidence. He submitted Calloway's statement. Then he said, "With the court's permission, I'd like to call Mrs. Vivian Briggs to speak." She walked to the front of the room. She sat in the chair beside the judge's table. She folded her hands and looked at Gerald. He asked her about the advertisement, about the correspondence, about arriving in Harlan Creek, about what she'd found and what she'd done about it. She answered all of it directly, in the unembellished way they'd practiced, and she watched Judge Webb's face while she talked. He was not a man who gave away a lot, but he was listening, really listening, the careful kind. Then Caswell stood. He was, as promised, polite. He thanked her for her time, asked gentle, reasonable questions about the documentation, who had organized it, how she'd obtained the witness statements, why such detailed records had been assembled only in the weeks immediately preceding the hearing. She answered each one. "Mrs. Briggs," he said, and his tone shifted slightly, still pleasant, but with the quality of a man who has arrived at the point he's been heading toward. "Would you say that the timing of your marriage was, in part, motivated by this hearing?" She looked at him. "In part," she said. "Yes." A small movement in the room. Caswell allowed himself a brief expression of satisfaction. "In what other parts was it motivated?" she said. He blinked. The question wasn't in his script. "I'm sorry?" "You asked if the timing was in part motivated by the hearing," she said. "I said yes. I'm telling you there were other parts. Would you like to know what they were?" He recovered quickly. "Please," he said. She turned slightly to face the room as much as the judge, not theatrically, just because it felt right. "I came here because I had nothing left in Omaha," she said. "My sister had died. I had no money and no family. I answered an advertisement from a man who said honest terms, honest life, because those words were scarce where I'd been." She kept her voice even. "I brought a cedar cradle that belonged to my sister because I couldn't leave it in a rented room. I carried it on a train and in a wagon and into a house I'd never seen, and I put it on a shelf where I could see it in the mornings." She paused. "I did not come to Wyoming Territory to save a legal case. I came because I was looking for somewhere to put the grief I was carrying, and also, if there was room, to be useful." The room was quiet. "My husband told me about the hearing early enough that we could have planned the marriage as a legal strategy if we'd wanted to," she said. "We didn't. We got married when we were ready to, which happened to be before the hearing, because life does not arrange itself according to legal calendars." She looked at Caswell. "Is there a version of this that would satisfy you?" Caswell was quiet for a moment. Then, "No further questions," he said. She walked back to her seat. Pearl leaned against her arm immediately, very slightly, which she suspected was the child's version of applause. Hale was looking at his table. Judge Webb was writing something in his notes. Gerald caught her eye and gave her a look that was mostly professional composure, and underneath it, unmistakably, relief. Colton took the stand next, and he was better than he'd been in practice. He was specific. He was honest, including about the hard parts, the months after Ellen died, the ways he'd failed to keep up with the property, the debt, the fact that he'd placed the advertisement partly with the legal situation in mind, and partly because he was a man with a silent child and a cold house, and he was running out of ways to hold things together alone. He said that last part simply, without apology, and the room shifted slightly when he said it the way rooms do when something true lands in them. Caswell tried the same angle with him, pushing on the timing, the strategy, the convenience of the marriage. Colton answered each question the way he'd answered Gerald's in practice, with the particular stubborn specificity of a man who has decided to tell the truth and will not be moved from it. "Mr. Briggs," Caswell said, "would you say your wife came to this property for primarily personal reasons or primarily legal ones?" Colton looked at him. "She came for personal reasons," he said. "The legal situation was mine. She didn't know the full extent of it before she arrived." He paused. "She found out, and she stayed. That's the whole story. She stayed because that's who she is," Colton said. "You'd have to ask her why. I know my answer, but it's not the same as hers." Caswell looked at him for a moment. "Thank you," he said, and sat down. Calloway testified. Ruth Marsh testified. The Swanson brothers submitted their receipts and confirmed their account. Hale's surveyor testified. Hale's 2 out-of-county witnesses testified. Caswell made his closing argument, which was careful and well-structured and utterly failed to account for a room full of people who lived alongside the property in question and had watched it recover. Gerald made his closing argument, which was not eloquent but was precise and genuine and included the phrase, "The court is being asked to decide whether a struggling man with a grieving child and a property in recovery constitutes a failed homestead, when what it actually constitutes is a frontier family doing what frontier families do, which is survive and rebuild and start again." Judge Webb recessed to consider. The recess lasted 40 minutes. Vivian sat with Pearl, who had fallen asleep against her shoulder with the absolute confidence of a child who has decided the adults will handle it. Colton sat beside them and said nothing, which was how he sat with hard things. Gerald organized his papers. Mrs. Alcott, across the room, caught Vivian's eye and gave her the same small nod she'd given her at the beginning of the morning. Hale sat at his table with Caswell and did not look at anyone. When Judge Webb came back in, the room went quiet before he even reached his seat. He set his papers on the table. He looked at both sides. He looked at the room. His eyes paused for a fraction of a second on Pearl, still asleep against Vivian's shoulder. He began to read. Judge Webb read his ruling the way he seemed to do most things, without theater, without preamble, in the flat and measured voice of a man who had learned a long time ago that the words themselves carried enough weight without being dressed up. He found the Homestead Compliance Challenge insufficient. He found the documentation of continuous improvement credible and well supported by community testimony. He found the surveyor's report presented by the claimant to reflect conditions at a specific point in time rather than the ongoing state of the property, and therefore not dispositive. He found the fraudulent marriage claim to be without evidentiary basis. He ruled in favor of Colton Briggs. The room did not erupt. It wasn't that kind of room. These were frontier people, not theater people, and most of them expressed satisfaction the way they expressed most things, which was quietly and with restraint. Calloway put his hand briefly on the shoulder of the man beside him. The Swanson brothers exchanged a look. Mrs. Alcott folded her hands in her lap and closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Pearl woke up when the sound in the room changed, the way children do, attuned to shifts in adult atmosphere even in sleep. She lifted her head from Vivian's shoulder and looked around with the disorientation of someone rejoining a world that has moved on without them. "Did we win?" she said. "Yes," Vivian said. Pearl considered this. Then she put her head back on Vivian's shoulder, apparently deciding that the news was satisfying enough to return to rest. Colton was shaking Gerald's hand. Gerald looked like a man who had prepared himself for a difficult outcome and was still adjusting to a good one, which made him seem younger than 34 and considerably more human than he had been all morning. Colton said something to him quietly. Vivian couldn't hear it. And Gerald shook his head and said something back, and Colton nodded. Then Colton turned and looked at Vivian. She looked back at him. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing that needed saying that the morning hadn't already said, and they both seemed to understand that. Across the room, Douglas Hale stood and buttoned his coat with the careful movements of a man controlling something he doesn't want to show. Caswell spoke quietly in his ear. Hale listened. He didn't look at Colton. He didn't look at Vivian. He looked at the room, at the people in it, at the arrangement of the morning that had not gone as he'd planned, and then he looked, just for a moment, at the cedar cradle. Vivian had brought it. She hadn't planned to. She'd gone back for her coat that morning and seen it on the shelf and picked it up without quite deciding to, the way you do with things that have become part of your daily gravity. It had sat on the bench beside Pearl through the whole hearing, small, weathered, present, and she hadn't thought about it much once the proceedings began. Hale looked at it for one moment, then he walked out. Caswell followed. The door closed. The room exhaled. The drive home was different from the drive to town. The cold hadn't changed. If anything, the afternoon was sharper, the light lower and thinner. But the quality of the silence in the wagon was different from the tense quiet of the morning. Pearl was fully awake now and asking questions, which she'd been storing up through the hearing like a person saving receipts. "Why did the man keep saying 'in part'?" she asked. "He was trying to make it sound like we did things for bad reasons," Vivian said. "Did you?" "No. But reasons that are partly practical can be made to sound that way if you're good at arranging words." Pearl considered this with the serious expression she brought to philosophical problems. Like how Papa said he fixed the south fence because the cattle kept getting into Calloway's field, but also because he didn't want Mr. Calloway to have to keep fixing it himself. Colton glanced over at her. "I didn't know you knew about that." "I know a lot of things," Pearl said serenely. Vivian looked at the road and said nothing, because there was nothing to add. They stopped at the dry goods on the way through town because they needed flour, and because normal life reasserts itself after significant mornings, whether you've prepared for it or not. Mrs. Alcott was behind the counter, having preceded them somehow, and she pressed Vivian's hand again and looked at her with the particular warmth of a woman who has seen a lot of things come out wrong in her lifetime and takes genuine pleasure when they don't. "You did well this morning," she said. "What you said to Caswell." "I just answered the question," Vivian said. "You answered the question he didn't ask," Mrs. Alcott said. "There's a difference." Vivian bought the flour and the oil she'd forgotten to get last time, and a small paper of peppermint sticks, because Pearl was standing near the jar with the focused attention of someone hoping to be noticed. Walking back to the wagon, Pearl holding her peppermint stick with the seriousness of someone who has received a significant gift, Vivian looked up and found Colton watching her from beside the wagon with an expression she'd begun to recognize, the one that lived just underneath the practical exterior, the one that came out when he thought she wasn't looking. She was always looking. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. He took the flour from her and put it in the wagon. Again, "Ready?" "Yes," she said. They drove home. But the week after the hearing had a quality she hadn't expected. Not relief exactly, but something more like the return of ordinary gravity after a period of suspension. The documentation notebook went back on the shelf. The property receipts were organized into a box and stored. Gerald sent a brief letter confirming the court's formal recording of the decision and asking for nothing in return, which was a gracious thing that she made a note to acknowledge properly. Life resumed its shape. But the shape was different now than it had been before. In small ways she noticed, and others she suspected she was still discovering. Colton talked more. Not dramatically more. He was still a man of measured words. But at the kitchen table in the evenings, and walking the fence line on Saturdays, he spoke about things that weren't strictly practical. What he remembered about the property when he'd first claimed it, 22 years old and certain in the way you're only certain before life starts editing you. What Ellen had said the first time she'd seen the house. She'd laughed, he said, because it was so much smaller than he'd described it. And then she'd walked inside and said, well, there's room to make it right, which was such an Ellen thing to say that he had to stop talking for a moment after he told it. Vivian listened. She didn't try to fill the silences. She'd learned they weren't empty. Pearl, for her part, had made a decision about Vivian that she didn't announce but simply enacted, the way children make permanent decisions. She folded Vivian into her daily life with the same matter-of-fact completeness with which she'd folded in Clara the rag doll, accepting her as a fixed feature of the landscape. She reported things to Vivian as she'd previously reported them only to Colton. She went to Vivian with the small injuries of her day, scraped knees, hurt feelings from a girl in town who'd said something unkind, the particular misery of losing a mitten she'd loved. And Vivian handled them without fuss, which was what Pearl needed, and without dismissal, which was what Pearl required. One afternoon in late February, about 10 days after the hearing, Pearl appeared in the kitchen where Vivian was mending a shirt and said, with the abruptness of someone delivering information they've been sitting with for a while, "I used to pray that Papa would find someone before you came." Vivian looked up. "Did you?" "Yeah, I don't know if it worked or if you just showed up," Pearl said. "Maybe both." Vivian returned to the shirt. "Maybe both is right." Pearl sat down. "Do you miss your sister?" "Every day," Vivian said. "Does it still hurt?" She looked at the shirt. "Yes, but differently than it used to, like a scar, kind of. You know it's there. But it doesn't stop you from moving." Pearl looked at the cedar cradle on the shelf. "I think about Mama like that," she said. "Most days it's okay. Sometimes it isn't." "That's exactly right," Vivian said. "That's how it goes." Pearl was quiet for a moment. "Are you going to have a baby?" she said. Vivian looked up. Pearl's expression was purely practical. "Because if you do, I think the cradle should be for that baby. Margaret would probably want that." Vivian held the mended shirt in her lap and looked at this child, this serious, observant, large-hearted child who had spent a year and a half in the particular silence of grief and was now, slowly, coming back out the other side, and felt the ache again, the one she'd been feeling since that first morning, the one that wasn't sorrow and wasn't joy and was somehow both. "I think Margaret would like that very much," she said. Pearl nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to Clara. It was 3 weeks after the hearing that Douglas Hale made his last move. Vivian almost missed it. It came not as a dramatic gesture, but as a piece of paper. A letter delivered by a writer she didn't recognize, addressed to Colton, from Hale's office in Cheyenne. She was in the yard when the writer came, and she took the letter inside and set it on the table and waited for Colton to come in from the barn. He read it standing at the table, still in his coat. She watched his face. His face went very still. "What is it?" she said. He set the letter down. He pressed his hand flat on it the way he pressed his hand on things when he was deciding how to say something. "He's not appealing the decision," he said. "All right," she said carefully. "But he's bought the Marsh property," he said. "The north side. Ruth Marsh's land." Vivian went still. "Ruth agreed to sell?" "Her son did," Colton said. "She's been ill. Her son's been handling her affairs. Hale offered more than the land is worth, and the son took it." He picked up the letter again. "Read the relevant passage. Hale's informing me as a courtesy, his word, that he now owns the water rights on the north side and the marshland, and that as my northern neighbor he'd like to discuss a boundary easement for the creek access." "An easement," Vivian said. "A legal mechanism by which he could route access across my north pasture to connect his properties," Colton said. His voice was flat, which she'd learned was his version of controlled anger. "It would essentially give him the corridor he wanted through my land without owning it outright." Vivian sat down at the table. She looked at the letter. She read it herself. Hale's careful, reasonable prose, the tone of a man making a friendly inquiry that only incidentally happened to serve his existing ambitions. "He's persistent," she said. "He doesn't lose," Colton said. "He just finds the next angle." She read the letter again. "He's asking for a meeting." "Yes." "When?" "He suggests next week, at his property." She set the letter down. She looked at the window, at the flat winter light outside, at the north pasture visible through the glass, the land that ran to where Hale now owned Ruth Marsh's 40 acres, the creek that fed both properties. "We should go to the meeting," she said. Colton looked at her. "You want to sit in Douglas Hale's house." "I want to understand exactly what he's asking for before we decide what to do about it," she said. "An easement isn't the same as a sale. It can have conditions. It can be structured to protect our interests if it's structured carefully." She paused. "Or it can be declined." "I'm inclined toward declined," he said. "I know," she said, "but let's hear the whole shape of it first." He was quiet for a moment. "Gerald," he said. "Yes," she said. "We bring Gerald." He picked up his hat from the peg. He stood with it in his hands in the way he did when he was thinking something through that didn't want to be thought through quickly. "She was sick," he said. "Ruth. I didn't know." "Neither did I," Vivian said. "I should have checked on her. After the hearing, she testified for us and I didn't—" He stopped. The guilt in it was specific and personal, and not the kind she could talk him out of, so she didn't try. "We'll go see her," she said. or her son. Once we know what the situation is. He nodded. He put on his hat. I went back out to the barn, because when things went wrong he worked, and she understood that about him now, well enough not to call him back. She sat with the letter for a while longer. She thought about Hale's systematic patience, the 2 years of waiting, the first offer, the second offer, the legal challenge, the fraudulent marriage claim, and now this. Not a man who attacked directly. A man who circled, who waited for exhaustion, who found the angle that required least resistance. She thought about her father's house going to auction when she was 17. She thought about standing on the road watching. She was not standing on the road. She picked up the letter and put it in the box with the other documentation. Then she put on her coat and went out to help with the afternoon work, because there was always afternoon work, and it didn't wait for anyone's problems to resolve themselves. The meeting at Hale's property took place on a Wednesday. Gerald came, which cost him a half day from his other work in town, and which he never mentioned, which she added to the account she kept in her head of things she owed people. Pete drove them, which also cost something. Hale's house was exactly what she'd expected from the barn she'd seen on the road the day she'd arrived in the county. Large, recently built, the kind of construction that announces money without apology. The interior was well-appointed and impersonal, the home of a man who'd furnished it to project rather than to live. There were no small objects, no cradles on shelves, nothing that suggested accumulation of a personal history. Everything was chosen, which was different from everything meaning something. Hale received them in a room he probably called a study. He was alone. No Caswell, which she noted, because the absence of the lawyer at a meeting about a legal instrument was either a gesture of good faith or a deliberate strategy to keep the conversation informal and therefore unrecorded. Mr. and Mrs. Briggs, he said, pleasant, unchanged, as though the hearing had been a weather event that had passed and left the landscape essentially the same. Mr. Hale, Vivian said. Gerald was introduced. Hale shook his hand with the practiced warmth of a man who knows how to make green lawyers feel acknowledged. Then they all sat, and Hale poured coffee from a pot on the sideboard and explained what he wanted. The easement was, as described in the letter, a legal right of access across the Briggs North pasture connecting Hale's 2 properties through a corridor along the creek. It would allow him to move cattle and equipment between the Hale main property and the newly acquired marshland without having to go the long way around through the county road, which would take 40 minutes extra in each direction and was particularly difficult in wet seasons when the road turned bad. The efficiency gain for me is significant, Hale said. For you, it's an inconvenience. I understand that, which is why I'm prepared to offer a fair compensation, annual payment, reviewed every 5 years, indexed to land values. He named a figure. It was not unreasonable. Gerald wrote it down without expression. Colton's jaw was set. Vivian listened. What would the easement specify, precisely, about access? She asked. Hale looked at her. Cattle drives and equipment passage, he said. Twice a year on the drives, maintenance access is needed for the equipment. And the corridor width? A slight pause. 30 feet. Along the full length of our north pasture? Along the creek line, yes. She nodded slowly. And what restrictions would you accept on the easement? Seasonal limitations, notice requirements, liability for damage to our fencing or land? Hale studied her. Not unpleasantly, he was too controlled for unpleasantness in a formal setting, but with the reassessment of a man who'd prepared for a different kind of conversation. Those details would be negotiated in the formal instrument, he said. I'd like to understand your general position on them before we consider the offer, she said, because the value of the annual payment changes significantly depending on how much access flexibility you're asking for. Twice yearly cattle drives with 60 days notice and full liability coverage is a different arrangement than open equipment access with discretionary notice. Gerald was writing. Colton was looking at the table, but she knew he was listening. Hale was quiet for a moment. You've thought about this, he said. I think about things, she said. He leaned back slightly. Something shifted in his manner, very small, but she'd been watching him since that first wagon ride, and she knew his tells better than he probably realized. I'm willing to discuss reasonable conditions, he said. All right, she said, let me be direct about what we'd require as a minimum condition of consideration. She looked at him steadily. Seasonal restriction to April through October, excluding spring calving. Notice requirement of 30 days minimum. Full liability coverage for any damage to our land, fencing, or animals. Annual payment reviewed every 3 years, not 5. And a right of first refusal clause. If you sell either the Hale property or the Marsh property, our easement agreement does not transfer automatically to the buyer. It has to be renegotiated with us. The room was quiet. Gerald had stopped writing. He was looking at Vivian with the expression she occasionally got from people who'd expected something less. Hale looked at her for a long moment. The right of first refusal on transfer is unusual, he said. So is buying your neighbor's elderly tenant's land through her son when she's too ill to make the decision herself, Vivian said. She said it without heat, just a fact on the table, like the other facts. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight and edges. Hale turned his coffee cup slowly on the saucer. He looked at Colton. "You've got a sharp wife," he said. "I know it," Colton said. Hale looked back at Vivian. She held his gaze. She was not afraid of him. She understood him, which was different and more useful than not being afraid. He was a man who moved systematically toward what he wanted and expected the world to eventually accommodate him, because it usually had. He was not accustomed to being met in the middle of his own study with a counter list. "I'll have Caswell look at the conditions," he said finally. "It may be that we can reach an arrangement." "It may be," she said. "We'll look at whatever Caswell drafts, with Gerald." Hale nodded. The meeting concluded, coffee finished, coats retrieved, hands shaken with the careful courtesy of people who don't like each other but have discovered they have to deal with each other. Hale walked them to the door. He looked at Vivian as she passed him, just for a moment. "You'd have been a formidable neighbor in different circumstances, Mrs. Briggs," he said. "I'm a formidable neighbor in these ones," she said, and walked out to the wagon. Pete was waiting with the characteristic equanimity of someone who'd driven enough difficult people to enough difficult meetings to have made peace with the waiting. He looked at their faces as they climbed up and seemed to read the outcome without asking. The ride back to town was quiet for the first mile or so. Gerald reviewed his notes. Colton sat beside Vivian on the bench, and she could feel the particular tension in him that was working itself out. The frustration of a man who had wanted to say no and had watched instead while his wife conducted a negotiation he hadn't planned for and couldn't quite object to. "You should have told me what you were going to say," he said, finally. "I didn't know what I was going to say until I said it," she said. "I knew what questions to ask." "The right of first refusal protects us if he sells either property," she said. "Which he will, eventually. Men like Hale always end up selling what they've accumulated. The question is always to whom." She paused. "If the easement transfers to a buyer we haven't agreed to, we lose the conditions. We'd be back where we started." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't want any arrangement with him," he said. "I know," she said. "And we may decide that's the right answer when we see what Caswell drafts. I'm not saying accept it. I'm saying don't close the door before we've seen the whole room." Colton looked at the road. "When did you learn to think like this?" She considered the question. "When I was 17, she said, "and watched a man buy my father's house for less than it was worth because my father didn't know the right questions to ask before he signed." She paused. "I decided I'd learn the questions." He was quiet for a long time after that. Gerald had closed his notebook and was looking at the winter-brown landscape passing on either side of the road with the expression of a man who had learned more this afternoon than he'd expected to. "For what it's worth," Gerald said quietly, to neither of them in particular, "the conditions she listed are the right ones. I'd have gotten there eventually. She got there faster." Colton made a sound that wasn't quite humor but was something related to it. They dropped Gerald in town and drove on home. The light was failing, the sky going the particular gray-pink of a winter evening that might bring snow by morning. Pearl would be inside by now, probably interrogating the barn cat, probably eating something she'd found in the kitchen that wasn't technically dinner. "Vivian," Colton said. She looked at him. He was watching the road, but there was something in the set of his face that was different from the drive home after the hearing. Not relieved, not settled, something more unresolved and more honest for being unresolved. "He's not done," he said. "Even if we work out the easement, he'll find another angle." "Maybe," she said. "Probably. Men like Hale usually do." "So what do we do about that?" She looked at the road. At the land on either side of it, Calloway's north field, the edge of their east pasture, The familiar roll of ground she'd come to know in the 6 weeks since she'd arrived on a wagon with a cedar cradle and no certainty about what she was walking into. "We stay," she said. "We work. We document. We build things that are harder to take than what was here before." She paused. "That's all you can do, really. You can't stop a man like Hale by winning one case. You stop him by making the taking not worth the effort." Colton considered this. "That could take years," he said. "Yes," she said. "You're planning that far ahead." She looked at him, the evening light on his face, tired, complicated, real. "Aren't you?" she said. He looked back at her. The horse kept walking. The wagon moved through the cold air. Somewhere ahead, the lights of the ranch, the kitchen window, the barn lantern Colton had left on, were beginning to show against the darkening sky. "Yeah," he said. "I am." They drove the rest of the way in silence, but it was the comfortable kind, the kind that two people share when they've said the important things and don't need to fill the space between them with anything else. Pearl was inside. The kitchen was warm. The cedar cradle was on the shelf where it belonged. That night, after Pearl was in bed and the lamps were low, Colton came and sat at the kitchen table where Vivian was writing a letter to Ruth Marsh's son, measured, factual, asking after Ruth's health, and noting that if there was anything the Briggs family could do to be useful during a difficult time, they were glad to help. She'd been composing it in her head since the afternoon. Getting it onto paper was a separate project. Colton watched her write for a while. "Guilt," he said. "Not a question." "Practical," she said. "Knowing what's happening on the north border matters." He was quiet. "Both," he said. "Both," she agreed. He poured himself the last of the evening coffee and sat with it. Outside, the wind had come up, which she'd expected. The pink sky at dusk was reliable that way, and she could hear it moving around the eaves in the particular complaint that she'd come to think of as the house talking about the weather. "I keep thinking about what she said," Colton said. "When you answered Caswell, about the cradle, about what you were carrying when you got on the train." She looked up. "I should have asked you those things in the letters," he said. "I should have—" He turned his cup in his hands. "I was so focused on what I needed that I didn't think enough about what you were coming from." "You told me what was important," she said. "The honest terms." "I left out things that were important," he said. "The legal situation. And on your side, you were carrying a loss I didn't ask about. I asked about your practical qualifications. I didn't ask about you." She looked at him for a moment. This was what he did, she'd learned. He stayed with things, worked them over, came back to them when he'd found the right words. It was a quality she'd initially found opaque and had come to understand was just the particular thoroughness of a man who didn't say things he didn't mean. "You're asking now," she said. "Late," he said. "Most things happen on a delay," she said. "That's not the same as not happening." He looked at her. The lamp between them made the kitchen feel smaller and warmer than it was, which was something she'd noticed about lamplight. It created intimacy whether you intended it or not. "Margaret," he said, "tell me about her." She set down the pen. She looked at the cedar cradle on the shelf. She thought about Margaret at 23, younger than Vivian had been when she'd lost their parents, still somehow certain that the world had good things in it that were coming her way, carrying that certainty even through the illness, with a stubbornness that had sometimes made Vivian furious and always made her love her. She told him. Not everything. Some things don't condense into a single telling and shouldn't, but the shape of it. Margaret's laugh, which was too loud and completely her own. The husband who'd left when the illness became a burden. The cradle built for a baby who'd never come. The rented room in March with the smell of coal smoke. The folded newspaper on the bench at the laundry where Vivian had gone to ask about work. Colton listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer comfort, which she appreciated, because she wasn't telling it to be comforted. She was telling it because he'd asked, and he deserved the real answer, and she'd decided, somewhere in the weeks since that first frozen fence line walk, that she was done with answers that were only partial. When she finished, the wind had settled down and the kitchen was very quiet. "She sounds like someone Pearl would have liked," Colton said finally. Vivian looked at him. "Pearl would have driven her completely mad," she said, "and she would have loved every minute of it." Something in Colton's face, something quiet and genuine, the look of a man who is holding a new thing carefully. "Yeah," he said. "That sounds right. She picked up the pen. "I need to finish this letter," she said. "I know," he said. He didn't move to get up. She wrote. He sat. The lamp burned between them. The cedar cradle held its place on the shelf, which was where it had always been going, even when she hadn't known it yet. Not a monument to grief, but a piece of furniture in a home that was, imperfectly and genuinely and against several odds, becoming exactly what a home is supposed to be. Outside, the wind tried the eaves once more and then gave up. The night settled in. The easement document from Caswell arrived 8 days later. It was not what they'd asked for. They negotiated. It took 3 weeks and 2 redrafts and one afternoon where Colton told Gerald he was going to decline the whole arrangement, and Gerald talked him back from it. Not because Gerald was certain it was the right call, but because he thought Vivian was right that they should see the whole room before they left it. In the end, the conditions were close enough to what Vivian had outlined in Hale's study. Not perfect, good enough. The right of first refusal was included, which Hale had resisted until Gerald produced a precedent from a territorial case that made excluding it look less like standard practice and more like deliberate exposure, at which point Hale's lawyer recommended including it. They signed on a Tuesday in March. Vivian read every word before she signed. Colton signed after her. Walking out of Gerald's office afterward, Colton said, "Is it over?" "This part," she said. He looked at the street. "But not Hale." "No," she said. "Probably not. But we've made it harder. And we've got documentation, and we've got neighbors who've seen what he does, and we've got—" She paused. "We've got time," she said. "That's not nothing." He looked at her. Pearl was ahead of them on the boardwalk, picking her way carefully around a patch of ice, arms out for balance, utterly focused on the problem of the ice and the solution her small body was negotiating with it. "No," he said. "It's not nothing." They walked to the wagon. The March air had something in it that wasn't quite warmth, but was the memory of warmth, the promise of the season turning, which the frontier made no guarantees about but offered anyway, every year, as though it couldn't help itself. Pearl made it past the ice. She turned back to check if they'd seen. They had. Spring came to Harlan Creek the way it always came to high country. Not all at once, not with any particular announcement, but in increments so small you almost missed each one until you looked back and realized the world had changed while you were paying attention to other things. The first week of April, the ground softened enough to work. Vivian was in the kitchen garden before Colton was out of the barn, turning the soil under the burlap she'd laid in October, finding it darker and more forgiving than she'd expected after the winter's severity. She worked with the methodical patience she brought to everything, row by row, starting from the east end where the light came first, breaking up the clumps that had frozen and refrozen through February and March. Pearl came out in her coat with her boots on the wrong feet, which she didn't notice until she'd been standing at the garden's edge for several minutes. "Your boots," Vivian said, without looking up. Pearl looked down, sighed with the theatrical exhaustion of someone who finds the requirements of footwear unreasonable. She went back inside and came out again with them corrected. "Can I help?" she said. "Take the far row," Vivian said. "Same motion. Don't rush it." Pearl took the spare trowel from the basket and went to the far row and began to work with the focused imprecision of a 7-year-old who is trying very hard and hasn't quite got the feel of the tool yet. She dug too deep in some places and barely scratched the surface in others. Vivian watched from the corner of her eye and said nothing. The row would need redoing. That was fine. The learning was the point. Colton came out of the barn an hour later and stood at the garden fence looking at the two of them working in the early light. He had his coffee. He didn't say anything for a while. "The north pasture fence needs checking before we move the cattle up," he said finally. "I know," Vivian said. "After this—" "I can do the fence," he said. "You don't have to—" "I want to walk it with you," she said. "I haven't been up to the north border since the easement was signed. I want to see what the marsh property looks like with Hale's markers on it." A pause. "It's not a pleasant sight," he said. "Most true things aren't," she said. "That doesn't mean you look away from them." He drank his coffee. Pearl held up her trowel to show him the clump of dark earth she'd managed to dislodge, clearly expecting recognition, and he gave it to her with a nod that was serious enough to satisfy her. They walked the north fence that afternoon. The marsh property was visible beyond the tree line, Hale's survey markers, orange-painted stakes, driven into the ground at intervals along what had been Ruth Marsh's eastern boundary. They were efficient and impersonal, the markers, the way Hale's operations always were, efficient and impersonal and entirely indifferent to what they displaced. Ruth's son wrote back, Vivian said. They were walking the fence line, Colton checking posts while she walked alongside. She's stable. Her son found a place for her in Cheyenne, a house on a quiet street near his family. She has her garden tools with her, apparently. She's already asked about the soil in the yard. Colton pulled at a loose post. It needed replacing. He made a note in the small book he carried for the purpose. Good, he said. Then, I sent her something before we signed the easement. I didn't tell you. She looked at him. What did you send? Letter, he said. And some of the preserves from the cellar. The one she brought over in January. He kept his eyes on the fence. I told her what she did at the hearing mattered, that it made a difference. Vivian was quiet for a moment. Did she write back? She wrote back to you, he said. That letter came Tuesday. I put it on the shelf. I thought, he checked another post. I thought you'd want to read it without me standing there. She'd seen the letter. She hadn't opened it yet, saving it the way she sometimes saved good things, giving herself something to come back to. Thank you, she said, for writing to her. He moved on to the next post. She was good to us, he said. Simply, the way he said true things. People who are good to you deserve to know it was received. They walked the rest of the fence in the particular easy quiet that had developed between them over the months. Not the absence of conversation, but the presence of comfort. Two people who'd stopped needing to fill every moment with words. She watched the marshland beyond the tree line and thought about Ruth Marsh saying, well, I'll tell you what I've seen at the hearing and meaning every word of it. She thought about what it costs people to stand up publicly for someone else's claim when they have their own vulnerabilities, their own things that can be taken. The world ran on those small acts of solidarity and barely kept records of them. That seemed worth noticing. April moved into May. The cattle went up to the north pasture. The kitchen garden came in, slower than she'd hoped in some rows, faster in others, which was the honest nature of growing things. Pearl's row was the most uneven and produced, inexplicably, the best tomatoes. Vivian told her this, and Pearl received the information with the composure of someone who'd expected no less. Gerald Pruitt came out one Thursday with his wife, whom Vivian had not yet met. A quiet, perceptive woman named Dora, who looked at everything in the house with the eyes of someone who registered information without commenting on it, which Vivian respected. They had dinner. Colton made the bits because he decided in March to learn to make biscuits, and had become, through the specific stubbornness that characterized all his learning, competent at them. They were not elegant biscuits. They were solid and honest and tasted of actual effort, which Vivian thought was exactly right. Gerald brought news from town. Hale had made an offer on a property further west, a larger operation, a man with a water claim that connected to a railway interest. He's looking bigger now, Gerald said, past Harlan Creek. He got what he could get here, Colton said. For now, Gerald said. He said it carefully, not wanting to alarm but meaning what he said. For now is enough, Vivian said. We can only work with what's in front of us. Dora had been listening quietly. She looked at Vivian. Mrs. Alcott says you're the one who organized the community response for the hearing, she said. The statements, the witnesses. People came forward on their own, Vivian said. I organized what was already there. That's usually how it works, Dora said. The organizing is the part people don't see. After Gerald and Dora left, Colton stood on the porch for a while in the cool May evening. Vivian came and stood beside him. Pearl was inside, deeply engaged in a project involving Clara and an elaborate scenario that had been evolving for 3 days and which none of the adults had been fully briefed on. He's right, Colton said. Hale's not finished. He'll be back in some form eventually. Yes, she said. That doesn't bother you. It bothers me, she said. I just don't think being bothered changes anything useful, so I try to keep it to a productive amount. He looked at the north pasture in the evening light, at the fence line they'd walked together, at the land that was his, and now, in whatever practical and legal and human sense the word meant, also hers. When I wrote that advertisement, he said, I had a specific idea of what I was looking for. Someone capable, someone who could hold things together. You found that, she said. I found considerably more than that, he said. He was looking at the pasture still, which was how he managed to say things he couldn't quite say face to face, and she'd learned to let him have that angle. I want you to know I understand the difference between what I thought I needed and what... He stopped. What actually happened? She looked at the same pasture. The light was going gold at the edges, the particular color of early May evenings that lasts exactly long enough to make you pay attention. I know, she said. I'm not good at this, he said, saying things this way. You're better than you think, she said. A pause. That's a low bar. It's a higher bar than you're giving yourself credit for, she said. A brief silence. Colton. Yeah. I came here looking for a place to put down something heavy, she said. The grief, the starting over, the everything I was carrying from Omaha. I wasn't looking for... She stopped herself, tried again. I didn't expect to find something to pick up instead. He turned and looked at her then, which he didn't usually do when they were getting close to the real things. He just looked at her in the May evening light, the way you look at something you want to keep clearly in your memory. Something to pick up, he said. This, she said. She gestured at, not specifically, not at the land or the house or him exactly, but at the whole shape of what had accumulated in 5 months. This life, this family. I didn't expect it. I came for honest terms and I got... She looked at the house, where through the kitchen window Pearl was visible, standing on her chair to reach something on a high shelf. This is more than honest terms. He was quiet for a moment. Good more or complicated more? Both, she said. Mostly good. He nodded, very slowly. He looked back at the pasture. I love you, he said. He said it the way he said true things, flat, direct, without decoration, slightly terrified of the landing. She'd known it was coming in some form. She'd been feeling the shape of it for weeks in the small gestures, the nightly fires, the biscuits he'd learned to make, the way he looked at her across the kitchen table with the expression she'd catalogued and never quite named. I know, she said. I love you too. And then, because he deserved to know the whole truth, I've known for a while. I was waiting for you to find the words. He let out a breath. That long? You're thorough, she said. It takes time. Something moved in his face. The relief and the humor and the warmth all arriving at once. A rare collision of expressions that she suspected very few people had ever seen on him. That's a generous reading of it, he said. I have my moments, she said. Inside, Pearl had reached whatever she was looking for and climbed back down from her chair and disappeared from the window's frame. The kitchen light was steady and warm. The May evening held its color for another few minutes and then let it go, the sky shifting into the quiet gray-blue of full dusk. They went inside. Ruth Marsh's letter was on the shelf where Colton had put it. Vivian opened it that night after Pearl was in bed, at the kitchen table with the lamp between her and Colton, who was doing the account book without the grimness that had characterized his relationship with the account book in January. The numbers were better. Not recovered, the word she'd use was recovering, which was accurate and didn't promise more than it knew. Ruth's handwriting was large and slightly unsteady but clear, the handwriting of a woman who had been taught properly and was working against a body that wasn't cooperating the way it used to. She wrote that the house in Cheyenne was smaller than she'd expected, and the neighbors were friendly in the distant way of town people, which she was adjusting to. She wrote that her garden tools were in the yard and she'd already identified which beds got the best light. She wrote that she was sorry to have left the county the way she did, through her son's decision rather than her own, but she'd made her peace with it because the alternative was bitterness, and bitterness at her age seemed like a waste of the time she had left. She wrote, I have been watching that property for 40 years, and I want you to know that it has never looked the way it looks now. The fence line straight, the woodpile full, the garden put in proper. Colton's wife, who is also your wife now, though this is not the way I'd have expected it to happen, has given that land something it needed that I couldn't name until I saw it. I'll call it intention, someone intending for it to last. Then she wrote, the cradle you brought to the hearing, I knew the one. Ellen had admired it years ago, when Vivian, forgive me, when your predecessor who became your sister brought it through on a different wagon, heading somewhere else entirely. It ended up where it needed to go. That seems like the kind of thing worth noting. Vivian set the letter on the table. She looked at the cedar cradle on the shelf. She thought about Margaret, who had never made it to Wyoming and never would, who had died in a rented room in March, believing that good things were still coming even while her body gave out on her with the cruel indifference of sickness that doesn't account for character. She thought about the cradle being built by two hands she'd never met for a baby that never came, and then carried across a state on a train and on a wagon and into a house that hadn't known it yet but needed it. She thought, intention, someone intending for it to last. That was what she'd brought, not just the capability, not just the documentation and the organized receipts and the questions she'd known to ask Caswell. She'd brought the intention to stay, to make it matter, to treat someone else's struggling place as though it were worth fighting for because, and this was the part she hadn't known when she'd first read that advertisement in the laundry, because it turned out it was. Worth fighting for. Worth the winter, and the hearing, and the long evenings of paperwork, and the frozen fence-line walks, and the conversations that circled the truth for weeks before they landed on it. Colton looked up from the account book. He looked at her face. "Good letter?" he said. "Yes," she said. She slid it across to him. He read it slowly, the way he read things that mattered, and she watched his face do the thing it did when something real arrived in it. The brief opening, the quick, careful close, the settling into quiet. "She's all right," he said. "She sounds like herself," Vivian said, "which is the best you can hope for." He set the letter down. He looked at the account book. He looked at her. "The numbers are close to what they need to be," he said. "Not there yet. But the spring calving's been good, and if we get the East Garden in fully, the household costs—" "I know," she said. "I've been watching the numbers." "Of course you have," he said without irony, the way he said it now, not as an observation, but as a simple acknowledgement of a fact about her he'd incorporated completely. "By fall," she said. "By fall," he agreed. Summer came with the particular extravagance of high country summers, the light that lasted too long, the wildflowers on the north slope that Pearl picked in quantities that exceeded any vase's capacity, the work that expanded to fill the long days with a completeness that left you tired in a way that felt earned rather than depleted. Pearl turned 7 in June. They made a cake with the last of the stored sugar, which was a sacrifice Vivian made without mentioning it, and Colton gave Pearl a carved wooden horse he'd been making in the evenings for a month in the barn, working by lantern light, which explained certain evenings when he'd come in later than the work required. Pearl received the horse with the gravity she brought to significant gifts and gave it a name immediately, Sergeant, for reasons she declined to fully explain, and placed it on the shelf beside the cedar cradle, which seemed right to everyone. The summer passed the way good summers pass. Too fast when you look back, full when you're in it. Calloway came for dinner twice. Gerald and Dora came once and stayed too long in the best way. Mrs. Alcott appeared periodically with information and occasionally with pie, which she offered without ceremony and which was always excellent. Hale's survey markers on the marshland stayed where they were. Hale's operations moved westward, as Gerald had said they would. The easement was exercised exactly twice in summer, twice yearly drives as stipulated, with the 30-day notice and the careful documentation of the passage that Vivian maintained because documentation was what you did, always, regardless of the current temperature of any arrangement. Colton noticed her logging the drive dates and said, "You don't have to keep doing that." "Yes, I do," she said, not harshly, just accurately. He nodded. He understood. The late August afternoon when it happened, when she knew, with the particular certainty of a body reporting information before the mind has caught up, she was in the kitchen garden doing the last of the summer harvest, pulling the remaining tomatoes before the nights got cold enough to damage them. Pearl was somewhere behind the barn with Sargent and Clara, engaged in a drama that had been running for 3 days. Colton was at the south fence. She sat back on her heels in the dirt and looked at the tomato plants and did the arithmetic she'd been half doing for 2 weeks and let the answer land. She stayed in the garden for a while longer. She finished the harvest. She brought the tomatoes in and set them on the counter. She washed her hands. She stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the land, the south pasture, the fence line where Colton was visible in the late summer afternoon, the north slope where the wildflowers had gone to seed. She looked at the cedar cradle on the shelf. She thought about Pearl, 2 weeks ago. I think the cradle should be for that baby. Margaret would probably want that. She thought about what Pearl had said and what she herself had answered. She thought about Margaret, who had believed in good things coming even at the end. She thought about a rented room in Omaha and a newspaper on a laundry bench and a train to Wyoming and a man who'd said honest terms, honest life, and had meant it, even when he hadn't told the whole truth because the intention underneath had been honest even when the execution was imperfect. She thought, this is how it goes when things go right. Not cleanly, not on schedule, not without cost. But the direction holds. When Colton came in that evening, she was at the table. The account book was there because she'd been doing the numbers. Different numbers now, different math, the kind that requires you to add a new column to the ledger. She waited until he'd hung his coat and washed his hands and poured himself the last of the afternoon coffee. He sat down across from her. He looked at her face. He could read her face now. He'd learned it the way she'd learned the way he expressed things, the specific vocabulary of someone you've been paying close attention to. What? He said. She looked at the cedar cradle on the shelf. He followed her gaze. He looked at the cradle. He looked back at her. Something in his face, the opening and the closing and the opening again, the hope arriving before he'd authorized it, the way hope does when you've been without it long enough that you've stopped being able to keep it back. Vivian, he said. Yes, she said, just that. The answer to the question he hadn't finished asking. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she could hear the house settling in the cooling evening, the particular creak of the board by the hallway, the far-off sound of Pearl narrating something to Sargent and Clara. Are you? He stopped. I'm well, she said. Everything seems right. I'll want to see the doctor in town to confirm, but she looked at him steadily. I'm sure. He set his coffee cup down. He looked at his hands on the table. He looked at the cradle. He looked at her. Margaret, he said. He said the name the way you say someone's name when you want to acknowledge them without claiming to know them fully. The right amount. She'd have things to say about it, Vivian said. Mostly loud. Something in his face broke open, just briefly, in the way faces break when the feeling is too real for the available expressions. Joy and grief and gratitude all arriving at once with no single word large enough to hold them. He pressed his hand flat on the table. The old gesture, the one for things that needed steadying. She put her hand over his. They sat like that for a while, in the kitchen that smelled of tomatoes and wood smoke and the particular warmth of a house that had people in it who intended to stay. This is the thing about the frontier that nobody tells you when they talk about the romance of it, the wide skies and the freedom and the clean start. The thing they don't tell you is that it is mostly just hard. It is hard in the way that anything real is hard, unpredictably, persistently, in ways that find your specific weaknesses and work at them with the patience of seasons and weather and men who have more resources than you and don't intend to stop. What they also don't tell you, and this is the part that matters, is what hard can make if you let it. If you don't turn away from it, don't dress it up as something cleaner than it is, don't pretend the resolution came without cost. Vivian Carter came to Wyoming Territory with a cedar cradle and a notebook and a willingness to do the honest accounting of things. What was there? What was needed? What would have to be built from what existed rather than what you wished for? She didn't come for romance. She came because the alternative was standing on the road watching, and she had made herself a promise at 17 that she would never do that again. What she found, what she built, which is different, which is the point, was not what she'd written in that first letter. Not just practical, not just a fair arrangement between two adults who needed something the other could provide. It was that, and then it was more, in the way that things started honestly sometimes earn the right to become something larger than their original terms. Pearl came in from the barn as the evening settled, Sargent in one hand and Clara in the other, her hair loose from its braid, her boots muddy again, her face carrying the particular expression of a child who has been completely herself for several hours and is entirely unrepentant about it. She looked between her father and Vivian with the perceptive eyes she'd always had. What happened? Happened, she said. Vivian looked at Colton. Colton looked at Vivian. Something good, Vivian said. Pearl looked at the cedar cradle on the shelf. She looked back at Vivian. She was 7. She was not a child who missed things. Okay, she said, in the tone she reserved for things she'd already figured out and was being patient about. She went to put her boots by the door, as she'd been told approximately 40 times, which meant she remembered about 60% of the time, which was progress. Outside, the August evening was going gold and then blue. The north pasture fence was straight. The woodpile was full. The kitchen garden had given everything it had. The cedar cradle was on the shelf where it had always been going. Some things come to the right place eventually. They take the long way: the rented room, the laundry bench, the frozen train platform, the wagon through the high country cold. And they arrive where they were supposed to, which you couldn't have known at the beginning, but which is obvious, looking back, the way all true things are obvious once you've lived them. The lamp was lit. The family was inside. That was enough. It was in fact everything.